Hello, my name is Andrew Ahn Westover, and I am the Key Pairing Director of Education and Public Engagement at the New Museum. I join you today from the unceded land of the Lenape people, and I'd like to begin by acknowledging and paying respect to the Lenape people and elders and ancestors, past, present, and future. On behalf of the New Museum, I'm glad to welcome you to this conversation between artist Carmen Argote and curator Margot Norton. The program will begin with a discussion of Last Light, Argote's first film, which was recorded in Los Angeles during the pandemic's first wave. Argote and Norton discuss Last Light in relationship to Argote's broader artistic practice, her recent solo exhibition at the New Museum, As Above, So Below, and new bodies of work related to the film. A few logistical notes before we begin. This program will start with a conversation for approximately 40 minutes, followed by a question and answer session. If you would like to ask a question, feel free to use the Q&A function at any time by clicking the Q&A button located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. Please note that this program is being recorded, so your question will be recorded as well. Our speakers will answer questions during the Q&A at the end of the program. Finally, we have several upcoming public programs, as well as a full suite of exclusive digital content, including screen series, artist studio visits, kids menu, and more, which I encourage you to check out on our website, newmuseum.org. This conversation also is co-sponsored by Clock Shop, and I will now turn it over to Julia Meltzer to share more about Clock Shop's work on this project.
Hi, I'm Julia Meltzer, the director of Clock Shop, an arts organization in Los Angeles. And from Los Angeles, I want to acknowledge our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Tongva peoples. At Clock Shop, we're grateful to be partnering with the New Museum for this conversation between Carmen Argote and Margot Norton this evening about Carmen's work and her new film, Last Light, which was commissioned by Clock Shop. This spring, we anticipated working on a very different project with Carmen, a series of 3 sculptures to be installed along the LA River. COVID and shelter in place forced us to change our plans, shift course, and to produce Carmen's first film. We're grateful to our funders, the NEA, the Pasadena Art Alliance, the LA County Department of Arts and Culture, and the Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts for being so flexible and shifting course with us. And now I'll turn it over to Margot to introduce Carmen. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much to Julia and Andrew for your introductions. And thank you all for joining us this evening. I'd like to thank Derek Wright, our Senior Production Manager, Andrea Calderese, our Manager of Education Programs and Academic Outreach, and Joshua Edwards, our CART Captioner, for making everything run smoothly behind the scenes. I'm thrilled to be here with Carmen Argote for a conversation about her first film, Last Light, produced by Clock Shop. Our conversation does not include a screening, so I hope you've all had the opportunity to see the film. The link for the film will also be available for a week following the discussion, so if you have an opportunity to watch it again following this talk. Last Light focuses on Carmen's daily ritual of walking, a meditative and reflective act that has remained integral to her art-making practice. Combining still and moving images of Carmen walking through an empty Los Angeles during lockdown, as well as her thoughts on an intimate voiceover, she reflects on feelings of vulnerability, mortality, violence, and her own memories of a city in constant transformation. As a brief introduction to Carmen's practice, she was born in Guadalajara, Mexico, and grew up in Los Angeles, where she is based. At the heart of her interdisciplinary practice is a continuous conversation between her own physical form and the location where she is working, often responding to the various cultural, economic, personal, and historical narratives within a particular site. She works with materials steeped in symbolic significance, such as coffee and pine needles, avocado, cochineal dye, which she layers, traces, and transforms. Her resulting works bear vestiges of her body's interactions and shed light on the constantly shifting surface of urban landscapes. For our conversation, we'll speak about Last Light and highlight some key moments within it as a catalyst for discussing some larger concerns within her practice. Carmen and I worked together on a slideshow, which we will begin, which weaves together the following elements. There are stills from the film, works made concurrently with the film, titled Hand, Dog, Glove, which were recently shown across 3 spaces in Los Angeles, including Commonwealth and Council, Clock Shop, and Stairwell Gallery, and images from her New Museum exhibition last year, As Above, So Below. So bear with us because we might shift a little bit between the film and works made over the past year or so. So this is the first image that we chose to start the conversation, which is a still from the film. And for me, it was kind of central to starting this conversation because it encapsulates so many of the themes that the film speaks to, which is this gloved hand, the ambulance, the interaction of the body with the city, and how Carmen often plays with scales and scale shifts in her work. So Carmen, I wanted to thank you so much for joining us, and I wanted and for your amazing collaboration with this talk and with your show at New Museum. I wanted to start by asking you how this idea to create this film came into being, this main subject of the film is your daily practice of walking, which is of course something you've been doing for years. But what was it that made you decide to focus on this act of walking in the format of a film?
It's the as Julia mentioned, you know, there was a shift that happened when at the start of the pandemic. So there was this other project that you know was that used walking as a process, but it was sculptural. And then when we shifted, it was just like this, you know, film seemed to be the right material because of the sort of psychological space that I found myself in both personally and that I was really kind of viscerally processing through my act of walking. So the act of walking for me is a thinking process. It is a way of processing, and it seemed to kind of just filmmaking and the psychological and the sort of processing through my body by being in movement made a lot of sense. And so then I thought, okay, through this process of walking, I'm going to search for what this film is going to be about. So I didn't start knowing what this film was going to be about. I set out into the landscape sort of looking for almost like piecing together these fragments or trying to find it, like the search, trying to find what the film was going to be. And at the same time, processing a lot of deconstruction in my own life. I had, at the start of the year, there was like a lot of shifts from moving into a new place, a recent divorce. I was hospitalized for several days. And so there was a lot of sort of deconstruction going on and processing, and there's a sort of parallel that goes on between my personal processing and then sort of the act of walking and how the like city and these fragments that I kind of found were moving through my body as a process. And that's I think that's what allowed me to find the film.
Mm. And you mentioned that things kind of shifted because of the pandemic. And I was wondering, how did these shifts that, or how did this affect the idea of the pandemic, or when it affected Los Angeles, did it change the course of the film? And if so, how?
There was a sort of everything became a lot more focused. The sounds became a lot more focused. Like when I look at this image, I also think about, you know, how it really allowed me to see things move forward in my walking process. When I look at this image, for example, I see the city in the background and I think about scale. And in my walks, I often see the city like at a certain scale, and as I move through the landscape, then, you know, I'm in like between the buildings, and then I keep walking, and then the buildings kind of like go small again. So there's like these like perceptions, and I think everything from the sound to the sort of lack of traffic, the empty streets, refocused my sort of perspective, and I started looking at the ground a lot and surfaces, and so it just kind of shifted my perception And I also felt propelled to be outside. There was this feeling of, shelter in place, go into the, like, a sort of closing. And for me, it was very important to be in landscape, to see what was going on, to be witness, to move, and to not sort of surrender. And I felt like, when I was in the hospital, I was actually like, I had that feeling of surrender, and it's something that I think about. And I think, my walking process has been continuous, and it's served different functions. But when the pandemic did start, it was like this need to be in motion in the landscape.
Totally. I had mentioned this to you earlier, but in watching this film again and knowing you in your practice, and kind of seeing your body in this, like, kind of vast landscape, which is very much, not designed for bodies, but designed for cars. I think of your walking as a really radical act, almost a kind of protest, as if, like, in this act of walking, you're saying, make LA desert again, or make the landscape relate to the body, because it feels so harsh, kind of in contrast to that, to that environment that could be more, more friendly toward that practice of walking. There's something that really butts up against the way that you're walking in the film, and the silence too, the openness that you see in that landscape, and probably you wouldn't see it in that same way if there were, like, LA traffic behind you, something like that.
Yeah, I think for, like, the, like, visuals, like, really kind of, like, resonate, and for me it's the idea of, like, being embodied, and these are photographs taken by Gina Klein, and Gina and I went on several walks, and it was like this idea of really processing, and in that process becoming embodied, almost like a deconstruction again of these systems that tend to separate us from our awareness that we are bodies in a landscape. And I think walking for me really brings that in. So when I look at this image too, I'm reminded of that, like, time kind of compresses, or like this awareness, where I'm reminded of, like, the silhouette of the city at one point, and then being in it, and there's a presence of, like, being in the here and now. And then as I move, then, there's, like, an awareness of both body, surfaces, time, that for me is very different than the sort of almost, like, disembodied, getting in your car, time, from, like, your domestic space to your place of work, or from your domestic space to where you're going to buy something. And there's, like, nothing in between. This is all about that space that is in between. And that's the site where the search happens. That's the site where I find what I'm looking for, even if I don't know what it is that I'm looking for, but it's a recognition of that. Yeah.
That's beautiful. No, I think, it's definitely that moment of reflection, and that kind of being in that space that is, I think there's almost a real lack of that your walking is conjuring up, because it's not often that we are in that space. And it probably also takes a while if we were to kind of go from point A to point B in that way, that we, might not have been doing otherwise.
Yeah. Sorry.
No, totally. Go ahead.
I was going to say that actually, like, that space is when I'm in the studio, or when I'm in process, regardless of whether it's a sculpture or thinking, or that's that space. That's what felt familiar. So in going into this film, that was the familiar space for me, like that searching space. And that really goes into the drawings that we're going to see, and all of those things. It's like a negative space.
And a productive space too, I mean, I think that, we're all kind of reevaluating what that means right now. And I think that, yeah, it's also, it can be very productive to have that space for reflection.
Yeah.
So I wanted to move on to the next image, which it's early on in the film where you bring up these kind of archival images from your childhood and speak to memories growing up in LA, taking the bus, crossing the street when you were a young girl. And perhaps during a certain time in one's life that I feel like you feel perhaps like more vulnerable in a very charged period and of adolescence. And I wanted to ask you what made you revisit those memories and include them in the film's narrative.
So there's kind of two things that kind of come into my mind. One thing is, you know, being like basically like really like from LA, like having grown up here, the landscape in terms of time, like the points in time compress. So if I walk through like an intersection or something, I've walked that intersection at different points in my life. So that's, you know, all of those points kind of come together through my personal like memory and experiences. And then from another point, you know, at the start of the pandemic, there was this sort of this not like unknowing, but it was more than that. It was sort of like a charge, like an energy that I was feeling. And I, you know, walking in Los Angeles and just like, I've always pretty much felt like in my adult life, you know, pretty safe. And then it was just like the times that I did kind of feel maybe like more threatened was in that like young preteen adolescent time when I would walk from my bus stop to my house, and I had to sort of like navigate. And there was this familiar, this like unknown threat or this thing with the masks and the emptiness and the sort of tension that I was kind of picking up on that felt familiar. And this was very much at the start when it, you know, I think everyone was kind of like really just sheltering in place, and I was like propelled to go out and feeling that tension building. Mm. And those 2 points, again, processing the landscape through the body, those 2 points came together, and it took me to specific memories of walking in diagonals, of like potential threats. It began to kind of form connections through time for me.
Mm. Yeah, I feel like this image is like so indicative of that, like having all of these crosswalks kind of in these diagonal movements intersecting. And yeah, you kind of feel this sort of vulnerability of the body in that way.
There's so much, and it's gendered, and you know, there's like all these layers kind of that come together. It's almost like, yeah, I remember feeling like if not threatened, then like small, or, you know, like having to navigate in different ways. Mm. Yeah.
I also wanted to ask you about surfaces, and the next images are taken from this section of the film, which weaves together these still images that focus on these like marks and patterns that you find on the surface of the concrete, also stains. And there's this one image, not this one, but and this one is great too. I feel like this one's very celestial with this like cleaning the concrete. But this one, where you're mapping your route on gum, like, or like the like pieces of gum that are like inside of the pavement. Mm-hmm. And there's something so fascinating, I feel, about these moments that combine the macro and micro, you know, the like natural and human-made markings, and the title of the new museum show, As Above, So Below, kind of came when you know, you mentioned that it relates to the kind of celestial and terrestrial spheres. And that idea was very much reflected in that title, and something that I think you've been concerned with for a while. So I wanted to ask specifically about these details on your journey. I know that you often have this practice of photographing things as you walk through the city, but I wanted to ask, yeah, about your kind of decisions to kind of take these moments in the landscape, on the surface of the city, and hone in on them in this way.
think in the act of being in motion, you know, there's like a refocusing, and I think about, you know, sort of when the horizontal flips into the vertical, that's like one action. And so in the show As Above, So Below, like that was very much like present, where like there was a literal flip from horizontal to vertical. And as I'm walking, and in this process of the film, it was like these moments really took me into, it shifted in scale from being a body in a landscape to the cosmic. So the you know, the liquid kind of pouring onto the street, like of like, you know, something being washed and cleaned at the beginning of like this whole thing, all of a sudden was like galaxies and solar systems. And then these sort of, I don't know, like traffic sensors or something become like orbits or maps. And the oil stains are like, again, like the cosmic, like, you know, celestial sphere. So they really take my mind there, but like simultaneously. And there's something about being in motion that does that too, as opposed to stillness. And being in motion, these gumdrops, you know, they as I look down, you know, the like gumdrops are almost like I begin to connect them, and they are both simultaneously like a map or constellations, and, you know, sort of moving at like these different scales through the act of walking. And so making that connection between these gumdrops and a map, or a way of navigating my body through landscape, that's kind of where the idea for this shot came, in terms of routing these maps, or these routes that are circuits. I call them circuits, that I was moving through. Yeah.
The next image is actually a drawing that you made during your process of filming, which I found to be really interesting, and was on view at Clock Shop last month. And I wanted to ask about this drawing in particular, because, you know, just kind of coming from those stills that were in the film and looking at this in close up. Actually, the next slide has it like even closer, where you can see. It almost feels like a kind of map of your experience. And I wanted to ask about this piece and how it came into being, and whether, you know, how it was for you in terms of like processing as you were working on the film through drawing in this way.
So this was early on, again, when I was trying to find the film. And again, like the surfaces, I think the gumdrops were almost like the first thing I laid down, and it was like an automatic drawing. I didn't plan out the composition. I used my walking route, so from my home space up, like, you know, towards like Soto, around, back on Mission. Like the circuit is basically what shaped the composition. And I would draw, I had been taking some photos of my shadow as I walked along, and the different lights sort of illuminated my body in different ways. But it was a combination of the photos, but also the experience and the memory of doing that. And so going into this drawing was just, it was like one shadow to the next. And I remember narrating to myself, you know, up Wabash, right turn on Soto, up around, down on Mission Road, you know, up on Zonal. So that's how the whole composition happened. And then these little moments were either moments that I associated with like something, like some moment that I would hold. So the sort of ovals or something, or like the shadow that I see next to Lincoln Park, with the way that like the light illuminates, and that's like a marker for me. But everything becomes like a combination of the experience of walking. Like the composition is shaped by that, by both experience and memory, and it served me as like a sort of, this is the tone for like the film. I had been, I mean, one of the influences was Octavia Butler's speech sounds, and that Julia had sort of we kind of started, and then I knew that it was going to be sort of like a science fiction, and this was like the first drawing that almost like allowed me to kind of see it visually, and it is also became a way to express or begin the conversation with the film team, in terms of like mood as well, like something visual. Yeah.
So I wanted to ask about the reflections in the film, going back to some stills, because they seem to be play like a really crucial part. Also, kind of like in these like conjunctures in the film itself, where you juxtapose these store windows, presumably when they're shut. When the stores are shut, with domestic scenes inside them that are often kind of bizarre, comforting, domestic scenes in storefront windows. And I love this one where you can see like the cars almost like ascend the bed. And I wanted to ask you about these reflections because they felt like such charged moments in the film, and almost like a time when a lot of things kind of came together.
Mm-hmm. So this specific one was like a point that I that constructed one of the notions in the film. And in looking at these reflections now, there's like me and the layer of glass, and then this either like this image or this thing, and it's literally like a reflection. And I feel like these are moments of confrontation or questioning for me. So questioning in terms of, what is this telling me that I should aspire to? Am I chasing this? Am I complicit in it? What is this desire in me? Or is this not something I desire? For this bed, for example, I had recently moved into my space, and I finally had gotten a bed with like these like fancy, nice linens, for the first time. And it was just like, what has it taken for me? Like I started thinking about both my personal processes and experiences and everything to have a bed like this. What am I chasing? What is this telling me? So there's like this kind of back and forth, and the glass becomes the surface that this, again, like that negative space, that surface that starts like asking me questions to be able to confront myself and my own deconstruction and notions of what am I aspiring to? Ideas of like what are you looking for in your life? And this one was interesting because there's like these cars sort of come into the bed, and it becomes, I remember thinking that it was like this sort of dream space, but also within the urban city, like within Los Angeles, this like sort of this like porosity or ephemerality or like illusion that kind of it's basically like conversing with me in real time. And I was like, that's going to be something that the film is going to be about. I can't like articulate the full thing, but I know that this is an important point. And so like that would be like on the map, like that would be like on the map. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, it's interesting because the surface of the window, I feel like, it's like it's similar to other works or other concerns that you have about surfaces, or especially about like these surfaces that separate. And it made me think a lot about our installation at New Museum because when I saw those images of reflections, because I thought it was really interesting the way that you used the glass wall of the lobby gallery in your exhibition. And what you did in what you can see is there's these LED lights that are around these very large scale panels of glass that we have as one wall of the lobby gallery. And they're the kind of lights that you commonly see when you walk around New York in like the storefronts of delis and bodegas. And that was kind of the inspiration for you to call attention to the surface in this way. I feel like it was a really subtle but like very significant gesture. And I think that there's something really interesting happening to this surface of the glass in terms of like it being this pane, this like supposedly invisible pane that separates the inside from the outside, you know, whether it be in the film, which is like this commercial space or this space of desire and the street, or in the case of the new museum, this space where the art resides, and then the space where it does not, the space of the cafe, the space of the lobby, the space of the street, and you can actually see the space from the street outside New Museum. And I wanted to ask if you could talk a little bit about your ideas behind the light installation, and if it kind of reflects or differs perhaps from what you were interested in in terms of the windows in the film.
Yeah, again, I think about walking, and I think about being in motion and the visual language that starts shaping perception and place. And I, in using the sort of reflection, you know, this kind of, again, it takes, it almost like takes the show, frames the show in like the visual language of the location for me. It's also, again, it's a conversation with the economics, you know, of the place, like both visually and a place for questioning. It also is in a way a portal for me, like here, like with the reflection going into the floor and the experience of it actually on the other side, with the reflection of the work. So there's a lot of these interplays where it makes you aware. Like I remember, like when I was in here experiencing the show, sort of like after, like really makes me aware of my body, and this almost like other dimension, and that kind of ties to the process of processing and looking for the work, to the artistic process, and also creating that dialogue or tension between, in this show, between class, between like different economies, between, you know, this language within the museum, this kind of connecting point from the museum to the experience of feeling that emotion, walking in East Harlem. Yeah.
And of course, there's like a very different feeling toward the lights when you put them on these like modernist, you know, panes of giant glass versus like a tiny bodega window. And I like that conversation, especially because when you walk in the city, you're constantly looking into windows. Like there's this experience of kind of looking in kind of as you're walking, especially in New York, that this, I feel like relates to, you know?
Yeah, things converge, you know, like that's where like the meaning kind of like things like these points converge, and then that's where the art gets made, or the ideas kind of happen for me, or the experience. Yeah.
And it was great because when you were in the space, you just kept seeing reflections. Like you know, it was one of the first times I think that I've worked on a show in this space where we used the floor in this way. And of course, like, as you mentioned, this idea of like going from the pane of the floor to the wall, was something that you were thinking a lot about, in this show with the As Above, So Below title. And I wanted to ask about the piece on the floor in particular, called Exprimidos, which you actually created in New York about a year prior to our exhibition, when you were in residency with Ballon Rouge Collective in East Harlem and did a show there. And when I saw this piece in that show, and then when we were in conversation about doing the New Museum show, it was really important for me to include it, both because you work on the floor, like you can see behind you your works that you're making, and how the floor is so important to you in your process. And also because it made me really think of a cityscape in the way that it's laid out, especially in New York, this like grid of Manhattan. And I was just curious if the city and the street and walking was something that you were also thinking about with a work like this.
Very much so. I mean, I think it's the repetition of block by block by block informed the language of the grid and the system of organization, and then bringing it back to the scale of the body with these sponges. That the sponges for me are like almost like feet, or like people, like, and then the sponges absorbing this liquid and then the liquid being squeezed and leaving a mark is almost like, for me, I was really thinking about, like people like, exprimidos, like the squeezed, both like in its physicality here, like as material, but then like in terms of our systems that squeeze our labor, and then all of a sudden it's like, like time just flies, and then you're, like how one is processed through like systems of capitalism here, so this squeezing of bodies, squeezing of labor, squeezing of process within this system of organization where, things are, like, and so like the organic mark is like almost like, I don't know, like what is marked, what is left. But they also, they have like this like scale to them. Like, so you see it as a texture first, and this horizontal, and maybe like a grid, and then as you approach it, your body and it as an object have a different relationship, almost a one-to-one. And then you go into the actual process of it.
Totally. And also like this silk material that you use, like as you were pressing these sponges on the material, it would like seep out into it. So it's also almost like this stain that's on the landscape, which I feel like is really, resonant with other works that you've done. Going back to the film for a moment, there's this scene that I really wanted to kind of delve into a little bit, because I just, in seeing recent works that you've done, I feel like this moment really resonates. And this is an image from inside of a tunnel where it seems like somebody has outlined the cracks in the tunnel with this like blue and red spray paint, as if to call attention to like the areas that need to be fixed. And in some instances, it's really interesting because the cracks almost like transcend the markings, or the markings are fading and you can't even tell where they are. But it also, I feel like, relates so much to this new body of work that you've been making kind of around the same time as you were working on the film, which is with these RX nutrition bars and pizzas, where they're almost like oil paintings on paper. Where and I wanted to ask you about this kind of mark making, and in these works, in the next images we get to some details of them, but basically, and also can kind of go into your process a little bit with them. But these RX bars and pizzas are kind of placed on top of this paper, and you can kind of see the oil emanating from these materials. Actually, in the next image, you can kind of see the process of how they're made. But then there are these outlines that you make on top of them. And it's so interesting because, the oil will eventually like go beyond the area that you've outlined. And there's something kind of that reminded me about like this inherent futility in this mark making, because the oil or the cracks will always kind of transcend this mark that's made around them, and for me it sparked a lot of thinking about this like idea of like the inevitability of change, which I know is a thematic concern in your work, and I wanted to ask if you could go a little bit deeper into these works and their relationship to these tunnel images.
It's so with the RX bars, again, it was like the searching and questioning. It's like, what is drawing me to this? Why am I, like, again, desire, like what is attracting me to this thing that lists the ingredients and the branding and everything, and ideas of class. So in my imagination, they have no grease. They're like, like health food. And so then the fact that it stains paper with a grease stain was like, what is it going to say? And so I organized them on a grid, and then it became like this language. And after like maybe like a day, it releases a certain amount of grease. And then, so that's when I started demarcating with a crayon. And I used a crayon because it was like waxy, like the the rectangle, you know. So it was like an indicator of, at a certain point, this is nutrition facts, the first one. It was like, at a certain point, this is the stain, you know, or like the oil. And then as time goes by, you realize that it can't be contained, that the stain kind of grows. And in like looking for that, so these almost like words became sentences, and the sentences then gave way to like these forms. And at the same time, it was the processing of these ideas that led me to understand what the work was telling me. So it started almost like the language started to deconstruct. And then I started using pizza because I thought it was going to be a big contrast. So it was like, oh, you know, individual to group, or, you know, like sort of a health food to, you know, maybe like more like fast food. But then what started kind of happening is like, actually the system is inside of me. It's like this way of, you know, when you blot a pizza, you're like removing, let's say, like 35 to 50 calories. And why do I know that? Like, why am I thinking about food in this way? It's the same system. So even though these systems are presented as different, it's actually my processing of them is within the same system. Like, why do I know that, like, you know, the RX bar is like so many grams of protein and the pizza is so many grams of protein? And what kind of disembodied idea of even like the things that I put in my body am I holding on to, you know? And so then through the process of questioning, it eventually took me to like reevaluate that language. And then these are pizzas, but now they're celestial. And again, going into the oil stains on the ground and trying to understand like these different like languages. This is powdered graphite with the grease. And instead of like maybe an outline, this goes where the stain is at a certain point in time, but the stain still kind of cannot be contained. So these attempts at mark making maybe indicate time, but they don't you can't control it. You just it goes into the fibers and it expands, and you know, it's outside of being able to hold it.
That idea of like unpredictability in these materials, I think it's something that has been happening in your practice for a while, or at least like recently, especially with like using this kind of all chemical processes, in these instances. And I wanted to mention the kind of big mural scale work that was in our show, which is called Patio con Citricos. And in the next image, you can see more of like an overall shot of it. It was a work that you made when you were in residency at the former home and studio of Gabriel Orozco. And I wanted to ask a little bit about how this work was made. And some of the kind of unpredictability that was associated with its making. It was something that it was always a surprise in a way to like see like how certain colors would or you know, materials and you know, natural materials, but also like having these like alchemical properties, like how they would interact with each other.
Yeah, so again, the composition grows from the body outward and is made horizontally. And this paper is coated with cochineal. And so when the cochineal is alkaline, it's like this grayish purple color, and then it reacts with acid. So I basically used lemon juice, and I'm sort of by pouring almost like little puddles of lemon juice and then cutting like not cutting but tearing like pieces of cardboard and placing. It's the like placing of something, like whether it's placing an RX bar or placing a pizza or placing something in relationship to the body. So here the cardboard sort of absorbs and releases. And again, there's time involved. So in its drying process, it's making the different colorations. So this basically only has two materials, cochineal and lemon juice. And the different colorations come from the variation and the processes in their reaction. But again, it's always I always find it really interesting how there needs to be this thing that exists and is placed, almost like that brings it to the scale of the body, like in terms of even composition and relationship. Yeah.
I feel like the body is always very much central in the work. And in the next image, this is actually a still in the film, but I feel like it could be one of your artworks, and I hope that's a compliment. I feel it reminded me a lot of these next works that were in the New Museum show, the Durams, and like especially for these kind of alchemical moments that are happening in the urban landscape, which you're also producing in your works, and these were created in a similar with similar materials, but the mark making is very different. And yet perhaps we could speak a little bit about these, and then we'll kind of move, because I realize we're a little late on time.
With these, I think of like paper and skin. These were basically there's a texture of like this bathroom floor, and they're coated with guayaba leaf for the gray and iron, and then I pour lemon juice on my body and I drag my body across the floor, and that's the mark. So again, it's like a direct relation between surface and body and scale. And that kind of dialogue, and these like little abrasions for me remind me of like little cuts on the skin.
Mm.
Yeah. So like architecture and surfaces as also skin and paper and like, yeah.
Totally. And I love how it picks up on the tiles of the floor. And I think we're going to kind of just go through the next images fairly quickly, and which, were included because I feel like they're also kind of alchemical moments where the urban landscape and these structures kind of intersect. Actually, the next image is a work of yours, an older work. I feel like it's a very crucial work that kind of keeps coming up with these pine needles. That you saw this in one of your walks, right?
Yeah, so it was like this relationship between the horizontality of this fence and the pine needles falling. And it's again like this reaction, visual reaction, where the pine needles just falling with gravity for me like neutralized how I changed my perception of the fence, changed its charge. So for this work, I used that moment of sort of interaction and like really brought that moment forward. And these are pine needles dipped in paint that have just been placed and are just held together with gravity. Yeah. This one. Oh, there you are. Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yeah. I can. I'm sorry. I something happened there.
It's so hot here. It's like California. But this is another point in the film. Again, like the chain link fence, my body, and the dog. This dog was on Mission Road, and it's again this like energy that was felt between the dog and the tension of the dog wanting to play, and it would start spinning, and then the dog and knowing that it needed to be a guard dog, and this sort of triangulation that was happening between me, the dog, and the fence, and our energies and those tensions. That became another point in the film. So the storefront window and this moment began to shape the ideas in Last Light. But again, it's that resonance between almost like energies.
And you did a whole series of drawings, which I feel like are so much about this relationship with the dog. Tell me a little bit about them and how they might relate to that moment.
So the two graphite ones that are on the wall, those were the first ones, and those really relate to that moment on the walk with the dog and the sort of exchange of energies between my body, the dog, and the fence. And that's why they're like graphite, they're like metal. And then when I kept on, in searching for the dog, it was like I remember it was never about drawing a dog with my hand. It was, I wanted to touch the surfaces of the city and I couldn't. It was like this almost like sensory deprivation and looking. As I sort of began to almost like embody the dog or relate to the dog in these different ways, I began to go inside into the sort of, like into the interior, into the domestic, into the psychological. And then these drawings kind of came into the home. And actually these were made when, at the start of the protests, so these kind of, these were almost I remember feeling like a closing into the domestic or something, this feeling, and they became almost like arrangements of flowers, like crayons drawing on the floor, trying to get out of their architecture, trying to get out of their structure, trying to get out of even the paper that contained them. And then the drawings began to sort of push outward. And this is one of the middle ones where it begins to push outward, trying to escape. It's almost like delineations, like the oil, you know, of the paper, like really pushing outward. And then that's the like drawings kind of, or the searching for this dog or this relationship between the inside and outside, the private and the public, our barriers and our, you know, like wanting to express ourselves like outward, our whole, to be whole outside of these systems that maybe compartmentalize us, you know, like really trying to find that in the drawing or through the drawing process. And the whole thing is like, this is like still like the film is going on, the RX bars were going on back here. It was all simultaneous.
There's yeah, there's I feel like, yeah, that psychological feeling of just that kind of porous pain in front of the dog of the fence, like it has, yeah, this energy that these are kind of conjuring. And I love that you use this word searching. It made me think about the avocado works that we showed in our show at New Museum. And yeah, I think even some of them were called like searching with the fingers, and that idea of searching is very present in these works as well. And I thought, and yeah, is that something that was for you in these, like a similar kind of searching? I mean, of course, it's a different motion, but there's something similar happening there.
Yeah, it's trying to find, like, it's being in this moment of the search, and then that moment is actually very much like being in motion in walking, where, you know, things will kind of come in to the mark making with like the glove hand dog. The dog started transforming into this almost like, you know, symbol in my mind of you know, with these, it was like this searching of for the composition or the gesture or the movement that felt to exist at that present. I remember that, you know, these had to be made very quickly because the avocado would get stickier and stickier. And so it was just like the gesture was either found, or it would be like, I would have to, like, sometimes it was a struggle. Sometimes it was like very much like a flow, but it was always involving searching. And again, the haptic, like, you know, and the relationship to the body and touch.
Before I ask the next question, which goes back to the film, I just want to remind everybody who's watching that we'll be wrapping up in about 5 minutes. So if you have any questions for Carmen or me, please feel free to drop them in the chat so we can answer them following these next questions. So in the next image is kind of toward the end of the film, where we see this smoke billowing from behind a fence. And it switches then to this footage of the riots in LA in 1992, which were fueled by a case of police brutality, the beating of Black motorist Rodney King in 1991. And we later see footage in the film from the riots, which were aired on television, on the news. And I wanted to ask you about the decision to bring this footage and and this moment in history into the film. Of course, it relates to a lot of, you know, the cases of police brutality that are happening in, you know, in recent months. But I wanted to ask you if that was something that you were responding to in the making of this film as well.
It actually, the decision to include the 92 riot footage was made earlier, was made early in the film, and it was from this tension when everyone was like sort of baking, you know, in their home. It was like this tension was building, and I could feel this tension in the landscape, like this. It was like a moment of suspension. Again, when I started thinking about walking in diagonals and this very visceral feeling of these systems that you know were these systems of oppression were sort of coming up, and the tension was building, that it took me from that point in time and that experience, and how that felt when I was around like I think I was like 11 or 11, and how the landscape felt and the energy felt, and then to like the present at the beginning of the pandemic and how that felt, and those 2 points connected. And so then I went and I was like, yes, let's include this. Let's kind of go into that. And the editor Aldo Velasco had some footage as well. And then there's the footage of that chain link fence with smoke. And that, again, when I was on my walks, that would take me to those moments as well. So there's like these, again, it's like these points of connection in time that process through both personal memory and history and the act of walking, and sort of drawing from the tensions felt, then become like visual. And then, you know, then afterwards, actually after we had decided on like unlocking picture, then like all the like protests and happened, and then it was like, wow, like the energy was there, it was true. So they came afterwards, yeah. After the police brutality, yeah.
Yeah, this tension you described was like so palpable, but it was like hard to describe exactly what it was. And then my last question is related to the end of the film. There's all this footage of construction site, and I love this still of this like dinosaur like arm, which seems like, you know, really menacing, picking up these piles of debris. And I remember that back in April, you had actually posted a picture to Instagram, or like series of pictures, where you had this like pile of gravel on a construction site, where you wrote different phrases and then would mix up and write another phrase. And the poem said, "There is only change, a changing landscape. Nothing stands still and everything moves. Live within a moment of change." And I wanted to kind of end with that because, well, first of all, I love it. And also I wanted to ask about this footage, and basically like what the focus on this construction site kind of meant to you in the making of the film.
So that was, again, another point in my walks, you know, where there was a contrast between the stillness of the traffic and, you know, not a lot of people on the street. There was, but then this construction was kind of going full on. It was like a combination of like demolition, construction, deconstruction, and there was like a lot of deconstruction going on in myself, but then this weird parallel where there was a lot of construction in the city, and there was like this outward push, like this like progress, like we have to get it done now before people see, or the city was like, you know, also like filling like potholes up, like at a, you know, there was this construction site that was just giant, and it seemed like it just picked up like even more energy when the pandemic started. And so I started visiting the site and filming, and yeah, these were like giant, these like dinosaurs or monsters, and it's about you know, the system of progress and, you know, capitalism and just like, you know, this pursuit of like, when like push comes to shove and, you know, like these things kind of began to shape this, yeah, like third point in the constellation of the film for me, in terms of like what the film was going to sort of be about. And then I was able to get really close to this construction site and film with my phone. Yeah, on my walks. So yeah.
Yeah, it's crazy to think that, yeah, these giant demolitions and constructions are kind of still happening all around us. The last image is actually, I just kind of picked it to end on because it's like, you know, the film kind of transitions from day to night, and there's all these really great shots of your hand kind of clasping these kind of materials. Some of them are like very natural, like moons, and then some kind of get confused. There's like a street lamp. Or cars and machines. And I think they're, yeah, some really provocative images. But we have some really great questions coming in. So I wanted to kind of shift gears a little bit to talking about those. And the first one comes from Amelia Carrera, who asks if you could talk a little bit about the title, Last Light.
So I went out looking for the title, actually. And there's two reasons why I kind of chose it. One, I saw this like LA streetlight sign and I was like, oh, that's like an interesting thing. And kind of just like that moment kind of stuck with me, and I'm like, oh. And then going back to like that shadow map and like looking at my shadow and how the shadows were shifting, you know, that also kind of pointed me to this idea of light. And there was this just kind of processing those things with, you know, everything that was kind of going on in terms of like, you know, ideas of ephemerality in the body and scale shifting, and like it all kind of started coming together, from the trying to capture the celestial and the light, to looking at the shadow, to my body and landscape, to these words on that LA street light, little like signage. It made a lot of sense to like, that's kind of what gave that title form. Yeah, that's how it came about.
Awesome. And so the next question comes from Julio Cesar Rodriguez, who asks if your use of materials and techniques are linked to your heritage, and if there's any reference of Yves Klein in your paintings.
I don't, they're linked to my life, you know, they're linked to the materials that, they're linked to culture, to my culture, to the culture that's a combination of everything from, you know, from, let's say like cochineal, and my knowing of, you know, them as like indigenous dyes and things like that, to like, but also, I mean, the RX bars are also part of my culture, you know, like, and like my desire to consume these things, and you know, Hershey's chocolate, and you know, lemon, like all of these things are just things that I live with, and so they're the materials of my life, and that's I allow those to kind of enter, and just as the city is also like a material, and the architecture that I inhabit, my home, becomes a material. So allowing all of those things to be in dialogue with the process of searching. Yeah.
And this is the last question from Andrea Calderese, who asked if sound has an otherworldly, who mentioned that the sound has an otherworldly feeling, and asked if you could speak about the artistic choices during the editing process that led to narrative comments and environmental sounds, and how, and perhaps expand on the influence of sci-fi and Octavia Butler.
Yeah, so sounds were really important for me because it was a way of bringing the domestic or like internal space into the exterior. So there's like my tea kettle, the washing machine, and these things are like propelled outward, kind of, you know, so that was a really conscious decision. Even like the sound of the drawing on the paper goes into the film. So it's like the way that we think about sound in our mind. There's no like distinction between, you know, inside and out. It's like fluid. It's a continuous circuit of soundscape. So that relates to sound. And then there was another part of the question
about sci-fi and Octavia Butler.
Octavia Butler. In reading speech sounds, you know, I knew that I wanted it to function in terms of like a science fiction in that way, where it for me it took like these different reference points and really kind of worked in the space of like fiction and the imagination, but also between like these different scales of like the you know, human scale and then the cosmic, and addressing these systems that are sometimes like more like elusive or like harder to see, like even like you know, I guess it goes back to like that searching. And when in reading speech sounds, it's like those tensions and that searching, that area of the not knowing, that tension that I was talking about in terms of making these connecting points between the 92 like riots and like the police brutality, violence, like right now that we're experiencing, you know, like these connecting points, I mean, that we have experienced, all of these things, the movement of like through time. I think that's kind of what resonates for me in terms of science fiction, and really honoring what science fiction can be. It is a portal. It's the doorway that allows like these ideas, these layered and complicated ideas to kind of enter, where we don't have our walls up. We allow these things to be processed, just like the you know, like these fragments or moments get processed through the body in like that motion. I feel like that's what writing and Octavia Butler's fiction allows me to kind of take in. It reveals, you know, and in other doorways that I might not, where I don't have like those like blocks or those blind spots in. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Carmen. No, this is really fascinating. It was a joy to kind of delve deeper into some of these ideas with you. And yeah, and thank you everybody for coming.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much. Thank you, Margot, and everybody. It's a pleasure.